It was the week before Christmas, and the air was filled with the kind of magic that only the holiday season can bring. The crispness of the winter air, coupled with the scent of fresh pine and the distant sound of festive carols, set the stage for what was supposed to be a joyous time for Phil. He had always cherished the idea of making Christmas special for his children, 7-year-old Ethan and 4-year-old Lily. It was more than just the gifts. It was about creating memories, fostering that sense of wonder that only a child could experience at Christmas time. For Phil, it was a chance to make up for the times he hadn't been there enough, the moments he had missed out on, and the way life had often gotten in the way of his relationships. That morning, with the holiday spirit alive and well, Phil ventured out to the toy store. There was a special gleam in his eyes, one that only a father could have, as he carefully selected toys for his kids. The joy of choosing just the right gift for them, imagining their faces lighting up when they saw the presents under the tree, filled him with a sense of purpose. His son Ethan had always been fascinated by anything that involved building or engineering, and his daughter Lily had an insatiable love for anything creative, from dolls to art supplies. Phil, knowing them both intimately, took his time, picking each gift with the same careful attention a craftsman would give to his work. Every choice was meant to reflect their unique personalities and growing interests. But as Phil made his way home, something else crept into his mind. The pressure of the holiday season, with its unspoken expectations and his own insecurities, weighed heavily on him. With a sigh, he decided to take a detour, one that would unknowingly alter the course of the evening. A familiar bar called out to him. It wasn't the first time he'd sought solace there. The need to unwind, to escape from the constant juggling of responsibilities, had become a regular part of his routine. And while he loved his family, the thought of a quiet drink or two seemed like the perfect way to take the edge off. It wasn't about the alcohol itself. It was more about the brief relief from the mounting pressures that surrounded him. Phil entered the bar, and instantly, the noise and warmth of the place swallowed him up. The laughter of old acquaintances, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation provided a temporary respite. He ordered his drink and sat down, his thoughts momentarily lost in the easy camaraderie of the moment. As time passed, the warmth of the bar seeped deeper into his bones, loosening the knots of tension that had been building for weeks. He wasn't thinking about his kids, about Christmas, or about the gifts waiting for him at home. He was thinking only of the relief, the brief escape from the constant pressure to perform, to be the man everyone expected him to be. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and Phil's drink was replaced with another, and then another. The sense of urgency that had accompanied his earlier shopping trip faded as he lost himself in the evening's distractions. His laughter joined the others. His worries seemed distant, and for a few hours, he allowed himself to simply exist, without the weight of fatherhood or the expectations that came with it. As the night wore on, the bar grew quieter, the neon signs flickering in the fading light. It was a subtle signal that the world outside was still turning, that the holiday season was moving forward, and that it was time for him to leave. Phil paid for his drinks, grabbed the bag of toys he had picked up earlier, and began the journey home. But as he stumbled through the quiet streets, a feeling of unease crept in. He had the presents, but the guilt weighed heavier than the gifts in his hands. He wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the dread of facing his family, but a quiet, nagging voice inside him began to whisper. He hadn't been the father he wanted to be. He hadn't been the husband Gina deserved. The road to his house seemed longer now, each step towards the front door filled with an unsettling mixture of shame and exhaustion. As he finally arrived home, he tried to be as quiet as possible, hoping to avoid waking his family. He was careful, almost comically so, as he crept through the house, trying to be stealthy with the bag of presents, trying not to disturb the peaceful slumber of his children. But as he turned the corner into the kitchen, the light flicked on, revealing a figure standing there, his wife Gina. Her tired eyes and folded arms told him everything he needed to know. She had been waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to show up, and now all of it was coming to a head. This wasn't the welcome home he had imagined, and the weight of his actions hit him like a ton of bricks. The guilt, the shame, and the realization that his choices had led him to this moment were suddenly undeniable. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, but it was the silence that spoke the loudest. Gina stood in front of him, her tired eyes fixed on Phil as he fumbled for words, his face flushed with guilt and the lingering effects of the alcohol. The holiday season, which was meant to be filled with joy and togetherness, had instead become a battleground between him and the woman who had once been his partner in everything. He could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the strain of holding it all together alone, and yet it was the quiet disappointment in her eyes that cut deeper than any words she could speak. "What time do you call this, Phil?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp, carrying the weight of the frustration she had carried for too long. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The accusation was implicit in her tone, the hurt clear in the way she stood, arms folded, waiting for an answer that would never come. Phil opened his mouth, but no words came. He had rehearsed so many apologies in his mind on the way home, but now they seemed inadequate. He had hoped that if he crept in unnoticed, he could avoid this moment, but there was no escaping it. The bags of Christmas presents in his hand felt heavy, not because they were physical burdens, but because they were symbols of his failure as a husband and father. He had gone out with the intention of buying gifts for his children, but now they felt more like an afterthought, a poor substitute for the real gift they needed: his presence. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Phil mumbled, his voice stumbling over the words, the apology not carrying the weight it needed. It was an excuse, not an explanation, and he knew it. The line between trying to explain himself and trying to justify his actions blurred, and it only seemed to frustrate Gina more. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the promises to do better, the assurances that next time would be different, but next time never came. She had lived through the broken promises and empty words long enough to know that they no longer held any meaning. Gina didn't let him finish. "I had to tell the kids stories, Phil. Convince them that Daddy got caught up with Santa's elves, working on a special toy just for them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you know how hard it is to keep spinning these tales?" Her frustration was palpable now, and the exhaustion of dealing with everything on her own, while Phil drowned in his own escape, was evident in every word. Phil felt his heart sink. The guilt intensified as he realized what Gina had done to keep the magic of Christmas alive for their children, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. She had protected them from the reality of his absence, creating stories to explain where their father was, and what was more painful was that he hadn't even considered the toll it was taking on her. He had been so absorbed in his own need for a temporary escape that he hadn't seen how much he was asking of her, how much she was carrying on her own. "I know, Gina," he said softly, his voice full of regret, but it sounded hollow, even to him. He wanted to tell her that he would change, that he would make it up to her, but the truth was that he had no idea how. Words had failed him so many times before. The real question was whether she could ever trust him again. "I know it's been tough. Work has been hard," Phil continued, his voice trailing off as he tried to explain, but it sounded weak, even to his own ears. He wasn't sure what he was expecting from her, understanding, forgiveness, anything. But all he saw was Gina's quiet disappointment, and that hurt more than anything. Gina's gaze never wavered, and when she spoke again, it was not with anger, but with a deep weariness that seemed to settle in her bones. "The children were waiting for you, Phil. I was waiting too." Her words were simple, but they hit him like a punch. She wasn't just upset that he had come home late. She was upset that he had chosen to be somewhere else, somewhere that didn't involve her, or the kids, or the family they had built together. She was frustrated not because of the lateness, but because, in the end, he had chosen the bar over them. Her arms, which had been tightly crossed, slowly uncrossed, but the tension between them remained. There was no immediate outburst, no fury. Instead, there was a deep sorrow that hung in the air, filling the space between them. Gina exhaled deeply, as if the weight of everything, her worries, her frustrations, and the burden of trying to keep it all together, had finally caught up with her. It was a sigh of resignation, a moment of surrender to the reality of their marriage as it stood now. Phil's heart clenched as he saw her shoulders sag, the weariness in her posture telling him all he needed to know. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about every night he had come home late, every moment he had chosen the drink over, his family. It was the culmination of months, maybe even years of his neglect of her, of their marriage, of their children. And now, standing in front of him, was a woman who had reached her breaking point. She had tried so hard to keep the family together, to keep things running smoothly, but she couldn't do it alone anymore. "I don't know what to say," Phil murmured, his voice breaking under the weight of his own realization. But the truth was, he didn't need to say anything. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. Gina wasn't waiting for him to fix everything. She wasn't asking for promises or excuses. What she wanted was the one thing Phil had been unable to give: his presence, his commitment, his real attention. And in that moment, Phil knew that the gifts in his hand, those carefully chosen toys, would never be enough to repair what had been broken. The only thing that could fix it was him, but that would take more than just showing up. It would take change. It would take time. And above all, it would take trust, something that, for the first time in a long while, seemed out of his reach. Tense silence in the kitchen was broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator, a stark contrast to the storm brewing between Phil and Gina. Phil stood there, still holding the bag of gifts, his heart pounding in his chest. He was acutely aware of the growing chasm between him and Gina, the woman he had once loved so deeply. The words he had hoped to find to make things right, words of apology, of remorse, seemed to escape him. Every attempt to speak felt like an empty gesture, meaningless against the weight of the disappointment that hung in the air. Gina, for her part, wasn't looking for apologies anymore. She was exhausted, not just from tonight, but from a long stretch of empty promises and unfulfilled expectations. But the conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. As Phil stood there, struggling to find the words to explain himself, Gina's phone buzzed. It was a sound that seemed out of place in the stillness of the room, and both of them turned toward it. Gina picked up the phone, her tired eyes scanning the screen before her face froze. Phil, still trying to process the weight of the moment, watched her intently. The message that appeared on the screen was short, but its implications were as sharp as a blade. Phil's having an affair. Phil's breath caught in his throat. He felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the very foundation of his reality had cracked open. His mind raced, but no thoughts could make sense of what he was seeing. The message was an anonymous accusation, but it struck him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't process it, couldn't comprehend how or why anyone would say such a thing. It was a claim so unexpected, so completely out of left field, that it took Phil a few seconds to regain his bearings. Gina, on the other hand, wasn't silent. Her disbelief quickly turned into a searing anger. "What is this, Phil? How long? Has this been happening?" Her voice, usually so controlled and gentle, trembled with fury and hurt. There was no time for explanations, no time for excuses. The sting of the accusation was immediate, and Gina's face flushed with a mixture of betrayal and confusion. She had already been dealing with the erosion of their marriage, the neglect, the drinking, the emotional distance, but this was the tipping point. Phil, in a daze, shook his head. His heart pounded louder in his ears. "Gina, I swear to you I'm not having an affair," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His confusion was genuine, his shock palpable. He had been consumed with his own demons, his struggles, with alcohol, but never had he thought that something like this could be the catalyst for their unraveling. Gina didn't believe him. She couldn't. "Then why would someone send me this?" she demanded, holding up the phone, her hands trembling. She wasn't looking for a defense. She was looking for answers, for a truth that had eluded her for so long. The phone, the message, it had opened up a floodgate of doubts she had been trying to ignore. She had tried to justify Phil's behavior, to explain away his late nights and his increasingly erratic behavior as a result of stress or work. But deep down, she had known that something wasn't right. This was the confirmation, the thing, that had been lingering in the back of her mind, but that she had been too afraid to face. Phil's mind raced as he tried to understand the source of this message. He had never been unfaithful. He had never crossed that line, not in any real way. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions, his drinking, his emotional neglect, his inability to show up for his family, had created a space in which anything, even an affair, seemed possible. "I don't know." "Who sent that message?" Phil said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. "But I swear, Gina, there's nothing between me and anyone else. There's no affair." But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions, his neglect, his excuses, his increasing time spent at the bar, had created an environment where Gina could no longer believe him. For Gina, this wasn't just about the message. This wasn't even about the accusation of infidelity. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. The lies, the avoidance, the quiet betrayals of trust. The distance that had grown between them was now more than just emotional. It had become physical, manifesting itself in their lives as an accusation that hit her like a cold slap. For months, she had felt alone, abandoned by the very person who was supposed to stand beside her. She had been patient, understanding, trying to make excuses for his behavior, but now it was clear that her patience had been taken for granted. "You don't get to lie to me anymore, Phil," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the years she had spent holding it all together. She had given him so many chances, so many opportunities to come back, to step up as a husband and a father. But each time, he had failed her. And now, with the accusation of an affair hanging over them, she could no longer deny that the man standing before her was not the man she had married. She didn't know him anymore. Phil stood in stunned silence, the world around him shifting, unraveling. He had always thought that his drinking was the biggest issue in their marriage, but now, as the accusation of infidelity hung in the air, he realized that it was much deeper than that. The foundation of trust between him and Gina had been shattered long before this message had arrived. Gina's tears were quiet, but they were real. She had waited for him, hoped for him, and now she was done. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply tired. Tired of fighting a battle that had no victor. Tired of loving someone who couldn't love her back the way she needed. She was done. "I can't do this anymore, Phil," Gina whispered, turning away from him. And with that, the silence between them deepened, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. As the days and weeks passed, the reality of Phil's situation began to settle in. The events of that fateful night, the confrontation with Gina, the shock of the anonymous text, and the unraveling of their trust, had shaken him to his core. Yet, as much as he tried to fight it, the truth remained. His marriage had been eroding for a long time, and the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The drinking had always been an issue, but it had never been this bad. What had once been an occasional indulgence, an after-work drink to unwind, had slowly become an everyday ritual. At first, it had been manageable, a way to cope with the stress of his restaurant business and the pressures of life. But over time, as the demands of his career intensified and his personal life became increasingly strained, the alcohol became his escape. It was his way of avoiding the harsh realities that loomed over him. The failures, the unspoken disappointments, the responsibilities he wasn't ready to face. It all faded into the background as the whiskey glass became his constant companion. Gina had seen it happen, though she hadn't acknowledged it at first. She had been so wrapped up in raising their children, in managing the household, and in doing the best she could to keep things afloat, that she hadn't fully realized how deep Phil's problem had become. The late nights at the bar, the secretive behavior, the increasing distance between them. It was all slipping by unnoticed, or so it seemed. Gina was trying to hold on, trying to keep the family together despite the growing rift between them. But she had never imagined that things would spiral so far out of control. It wasn't just the drinking. It was everything else. The way Phil had withdrawn emotionally. The way he had become increasingly disconnected from her and the children. The man she had once known, the man she had married, was slipping away, leaving a shell behind. She had tried to cover for him, to make excuses for his behavior. But eventually, even she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The cracks in their relationship had deepened until they could no longer be ignored. For Phil, it wasn't until the night of the confrontation that the weight of his actions truly hit him. Standing in front of Gina, seeing the hurt and disappointment in her eyes, he felt like a stranger in his own life. He had always prided himself on being a provider, on being someone who could take care of his family. But now, all he saw was the shattered remnants of the man he used to be. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the shame. He had let Gina down in ways he never thought possible, and worse, he had let his children down. He had become someone they couldn't rely on, someone who was no longer the strong, dependable father they had once known. But even as Phil struggled with these realizations, the cracks in their marriage continued to grow. The anonymous text had been the breaking point, but it wasn't the cause. The cause had been his growing addiction, his inability to be present when it mattered most, and the way he had chosen alcohol over everything else in his life. The day the text arrived, it was like the universe had decided to expose the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Gina, too, had her own breaking point. She had spent years defending Phil, explaining his actions to others, making excuses for him, but in the end, she had nothing left to give. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. She couldn't continue living in a marriage where the man she loved had become a stranger. The emotional toll of carrying this burden alone had finally caught up with her. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and she couldn't keep it up anymore. The phone call with her friends, the long nights spent wondering if things would ever get better, had left her weary. She had tried everything to save their marriage. She had been patient. She had been understanding. But now it was clear she couldn't do it alone. The idea of being in a relationship where trust was continually broken, where promises were empty, was no longer something she was willing to endure. In the weeks that followed, Gina's presence in the house became quieter. She was still there, still taking care of the children, still managing the day-to-day life, but the emotional distance between her and Phil had reached a point where it felt insurmountable. The love they once shared, the connection they had built, over years of marriage, seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a cold silence that neither of them knew how to bridge. Phil, for his part, continued to struggle with his addiction. It was easier to drown in the bottle than to face the reality of what he had done. His business was faltering, his friends were growing distant, and the weight of his failures was becoming unbearable. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man he barely recognized, someone who had allowed his demons to control him. But even in his darkest moments, there was a part of him that still wanted to fight, that still wanted to try and fix everything. The problem was, he didn't know how. And that uncertainty, that lack of direction, only fed his sense of helplessness. It was in the silence of their home, in the spaces between their conversations, that the realization hit Phil the hardest. He had lost everything. The man he had been was gone, and in his place was someone he didn't know how to be. The future of his marriage, of his family, seemed uncertain, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if there was a way back. In the fog. Weeks that followed, the cracks in their marriage were too large to ignore. The erosion had been slow, gradual, but now it was undeniable. The man who had once promised to love and cherish his wife and children had become someone who was barely holding it together. And as Gina looked at the man she had once loved, she knew deep down that things would never be the same. In the aftermath of the confrontation with Gina, Phil's world seemed to be spiraling out of control. The intensity of the situation, the sudden realization that his marriage was unraveling, the guilt and shame for what he had done, and the overwhelming weight of his addiction had left him feeling numb. His personal life was a mess, and so was his business. The restaurant that had once been his pride and joy was no longer the thriving establishment it had been. The bustling atmosphere, the excitement of a successful venture, had faded, replaced by a creeping sense of failure and desperation. His restaurant, once the talk of the town, now seemed to be gasping for air, struggling to stay afloat in an increasingly competitive market. But for Phil, the business had always been more than just a livelihood. It had been an extension of himself, a testament to his hard work and determination. Now it felt like a reminder of everything that was slipping away from him. He had poured his heart and soul into the restaurant, but in doing so, he had neglected the people who mattered most, Gina and their children. His constant focus on work had come at the expense of his family, and now the business was crumbling just as his marriage was. In his isolation, Phil found himself retreating to the one place that still felt like it needed him, the restaurant. The once vibrant dining room was now a quiet, hollow space, a stark reflection of his own emotional state. He spent long hours at the office, working late into the night, trying to fix the problems with the business that seemed to multiply by the day. But no matter how much he worked, it didn't change the fact that his personal life was in turmoil. The weight of his responsibilities, both at home and at work, seemed too much for him to bear, and he was slowly sinking under the pressure. It was during this time of struggle that Anna, a waitress at the restaurant, became a steady presence in his life. She had worked alongside him for months, witnessing the ups and downs of the business, but she had never judged him. Her kindness and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to his own disarray. While Phil had become consumed with his own self-doubt and addiction, Anna had remained grounded, unaffected by the chaos around her. She continued to show up every day, doing her job with quiet professionalism, and in her own way, she had become a source of stability for him. One evening, as Phil sat in the office, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him, Anna came to him with a suggestion. She had noticed the growing strain on Phil, both personally and professionally, and she wanted to help. She suggested that they take a break, leave the city for a while, get away from the stress and the constant reminders of his struggles. It was an idea that surprised Phil, but in his current state, it was one that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, the thought of escaping the suffocating pressure seemed like a lifeline. Phil agreed to Anna's suggestion, and they planned a trip, a brief getaway to clear his mind and hopefully find a sense of peace. For Phil, it wasn't just about getting away from the restaurant or the business. It was about disconnecting from the spiral he had found himself in. It was a chance to take a step back, to reevaluate his life and his choices. He knew that he needed to change, but he didn't know how. The trip was a chance to begin that process, to give himself a break from the chaos and to focus on his own healing. As the days passed, Phil slowly began to open up to Anna about his struggles. He talked about his addiction, his guilt, and the fear that had been driving him. Anna listened without judgment, offering him the kind of support and understanding that he had longed for, but never thought he deserved. She had become a sounding board for his frustrations, a constant presence in his life that didn't push him, but simply let him be. Through Anna's encouragement, Phil began to slowly confront the demons that had been plaguing him. He realized that the addiction was more than just a coping mechanism for the stress. It was a way for him to avoid dealing with the real issues in his life: the loss of his marriage, the strain in his family, the collapse of his business. These were the things he had been running from, and the alcohol had been his escape. But with Anna's support, Phil began to understand that the only way to move forward was to face these issues head-on. The trip, though brief, was a turning point for Phil. It gave him the space to reflect on his life, his mistakes, and the path he needed to take. He returned to the restaurant with a renewed sense of determination, ready to tackle the challenges that lay ahead. But when he arrived, he found that things had changed in his absence. Rebecca, a former janitor and dishwasher, had stepped up in Phil's absence. She had always been a hard worker, but now, with Phil away, she had taken charge of the restaurant. Her presence was a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the sense of stagnation that had permeated the place before. She had made changes, small, subtle changes, that had already begun to have a positive impact on the business. The restaurant felt warmer, more inviting, and the staff seemed more energized. Rebecca had injected new life into the place, and Phil couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for what she had done in his absence. But as he watched her work, he realized something else. He couldn't continue to run the restaurant the way he had been. The demands of the business, the pressure to succeed, had taken too much of a toll on him. He couldn't keep pushing himself to the brink. He needed to step away, at least for a while, to focus on his own recovery and the rebuilding of his family. It was with this in mind that Phil made the decision to step back from the restaurant. He realized that the weight of responsibility, of running the business and trying to salvage his marriage, had become too much for him to bear alone. He needed to trust someone else to carry the load for a while, and he knew that Rebecca was the person to do it. With that decision, he finally acknowledged that he couldn't fix everything on his own. It was time to lean on others, to allow them to help him carry the weight of his responsibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Phil felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild the pieces of his life. Phil's return from the brief getaway was bittersweet. The trip had given him the space to reflect on his life and the consequences of his actions. It had allowed him to confront the addiction that had been driving him and come to terms with the broken state of his marriage and business. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his choices, but also a glimmer of hope that change was possible. However, as he walked back into the familiar yet now foreign world of the restaurant, he realized just how much had changed in his absence. The restaurant, once a thriving and bustling hub, had felt like a lifeline to Phil. It was his creation, his pride, but in recent months, it had mirrored his personal decline. When he left, it seemed as though the soul of the place had left with him, swallowed by his neglect and the slow collapse of his family life. But now, things looked different. As he stepped inside, the familiar clinking of plates and the bustle of the kitchen greeted him. But there was a new energy in the air. The once bleak environment, filled with tension and resignation, now felt warm and inviting. The transformation was not just in the atmosphere, but in the people. Rebecca, the janitor and dishwasher, had taken on a leadership role in Phil's absence. At first, Phil had been hesitant about leaving the restaurant in her hands. She had always been a dedicated worker, but managing a restaurant was an entirely different beast. However, in the weeks since he had left, Rebecca had proved herself. She had taken charge of the staff, organized operations, and started making small yet significant changes to revitalize the place. She had breathed new life into the restaurant, creating a sense of warmth and efficiency that Phil hadn't realized had been missing. When he saw the changes in the restaurant, a wave of gratitude washed over him. Rebecca had not only managed to keep the restaurant afloat during his absence, but she had also made it thrive. She had done this with little experience but a great deal of heart, proving to Phil that she was more than just a janitor. She was someone who could truly lead. As he looked around at the bustling staff and the vibrant new decor, he realized how much he had taken for granted before. The restaurant was no longer just a business to him. It was a community, a place where people had come together to work and create something meaningful. But despite the progress, Phil knew deep down that he couldn't continue running the restaurant the way he had. His personal life had fallen apart, and the business was suffering because of it. He had let the pressure and the stress of his life consume him, and it had reflected in every corner of the restaurant. It was clear to him now that he couldn't handle both his family and the business alone. He needed help, and Rebecca had proven she was the right person to carry the responsibility while he took a step back. Phil's decision to step away from the restaurant was not easy. It was an admission of his limitations, something he had never been willing to accept before. But it was also an act of trust. Trust in Rebecca and the rest of the staff to carry the burden while he focused on his personal healing. He knew that, if he didn't step back, he would continue to spiral, and that would only harm the people he cared about most. His family and his health had to come first, and the restaurant would have to wait. As he shared this decision with Rebecca, she was initially shocked, unsure of how to handle such a responsibility. "I'm just a dishwasher," she had said. But Phil, with a sense of quiet conviction, reminded her that she was much more than that. He had seen her work ethic, her dedication, and her ability to lead. It was time for her to prove to herself that she could manage the restaurant and, in doing so, help Phil take the first step toward recovery. The transfer of responsibility to Rebecca was a turning point for both of them. For Phil, it was the beginning of a long road to self-acceptance. He was finally allowing himself to let go of the things that had held him captive: his pride, his sense of control, and his fear of failure. For Rebecca, it was an opportunity to rise to the occasion, to show everyone, especially herself, that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. As Phil stepped away from the daily grind of the restaurant, he found himself with more time to focus on his family. His relationship with Gina had been strained to the breaking point, but now there was a chance to rebuild it. He began to see the importance of being present, not just physically, but emotionally. He could no longer afford to be absent from his children's lives or from Gina's. His drinking had stolen so many precious moments, and now he was determined to make up for them. Gina, for her part, was cautiously optimistic. She had spent so long waiting for Phil to change, and though she was hurt, she still loved him. She knew that rebuilding their marriage would take time, and there was no guarantee that it would work. But seeing Phil make the conscious decision to step away from his business and focus on his recovery was a sign that he was willing to try. She wasn't ready to forgive him just yet, but she was open to the possibility that they could find their way back to each other. For Phil, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was also filled with hope. He had begun to take the first steps toward healing, emotionally, physically, and mentally. The restaurant, while important, was no longer his sole focus. His family was his priority, and he was willing to fight for them. It was a new beginning, not just for his marriage, but for his life. The changes weren't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Phil felt like he was on the right path. As the days passed and Phil stepped further into his decision to take a step back from the restaurant, the weight of responsibility began to feel more manageable. He had placed his trust in Rebecca, and she had proven herself more than capable of taking charge. However, even with the restaurant in capable hands, Phil knew the real test lay elsewhere. In his ability to heal his fractured relationships, most importantly, with Gina. The road to mending their marriage wasn't going to be simple. Years of neglect and emotional distance couldn't be erased overnight, but this time, there was a genuine determination in Phil's heart to try. The shift in focus from work to family was jarring at first, like stepping into unfamiliar territory. Phil had been so consumed with the business, so immersed in the day-to-day grind, that he had forgotten how to simply be present. Now, with more time on his hands, he found himself spending more moments at home, sitting with his children, playing with them, and trying to engage in meaningful conversations with Gina. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always welcomed. Gina had been hurt too many times before, and she was understandably guarded. But she wasn't giving up either. Her love for Phil still lingered, even if it was buried beneath layers of frustration, hurt, and disappointment. One evening, as Phil sat on the couch with his children, he couldn't help but notice how much had changed. Ethan, now 7, was reading a book with intense focus, while little Lily, 4, was playing with her dolls, her face lit with the kind of innocence only a child could possess. The house, though quiet and peaceful, felt warm. Phil had missed these moments, the simple ones where life wasn't about meetings, deadlines, or keeping up appearances. It was about family, connection, and the love that once thrived between him and Gina. Still, there was a shadow hanging over them. As much as he wanted to rebuild, the wounds in their relationship were deep. Gina, though not outwardly angry anymore, was still distant. She didn't know if she could trust Phil again. She didn't know if the man she had loved and built a life with was truly back, or if this was just another temporary phase. The emotional scars of years of neglect and broken promises didn't heal overnight. Phil felt the weight of her silence. He knew that she needed time, and he wasn't going to rush her. But there were moments when the silence between them felt suffocating, when his desire to bridge the gap was met with her reluctance to engage. He could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, the way she hesitated before speaking, as if every word needed to be carefully considered. She had put up walls, and rightfully so. He had broken her trust too many times. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Gina sat down across from Phil. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a certain softness in her eyes that gave him hope. She wasn't angry. She wasn't closing herself off completely. She was simply being honest, something that had been missing from their marriage for a long time. "I don't know if I can do this, Phil," Gina said quietly, her voice low and measured. "I don't know if I can trust you again. You've hurt me so many times, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going through this." Phil's heart clenched, and for a moment, he felt like the ground had fallen out from beneath him. Her words were both a confession and a challenge. She was willing to try, but only if he could prove he was truly committed to change. She needed to see that he was serious, that this wasn't just another empty promise. The years of betrayal, of him choosing the bottle over his family, had taken their toll. And now, after everything, she needed to know that he could truly be the man she needed him to be. "I understand," Phil replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've hurt you, Gina, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I promise you, I'm not the same man I was. I'm going to do whatever it takes to prove that to you. I know it won't be easy, and I know I don't deserve your trust. But I'm asking you for a chance to show you I can be the man I used to be, the man you loved." Gina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the floor. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from anger. It was the kind that came from deep emotional exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that only years of hurt and disappointment could bring. Finally, Gina spoke again, her voice tinged with a quiet sorrow. "I'm not asking for a perfect man, Phil. I'm not asking for the old you to come back. I just need to know that you're here, really here. I need to know that you're willing to fight for this, for us." Phil nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. For the first time in a long time, he truly understood the depth of her pain. It wasn't just about the drinking or the late nights. It was about feeling abandoned, neglected, and unimportant. Gina had carried the weight of their family for years, and now she needed to see that Phil was ready to carry it with her. "I'm here," Phil said firmly, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion in his chest. "And I will fight for us, Gina. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for this family. You don't have to do it alone anymore." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was not the oppressive, suffocating silence of distance, but the quiet of two people standing at a crossroads, unsure of where the road would lead, but willing to walk it together. In that moment, Phil realized that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take time, patience, and consistent effort. But the most important thing was that Gina had seen his sincerity. She had heard the depth of his commitment, and though she wasn't ready to fully trust him again, she was willing to give him the chance to prove himself. It was the first step in the long, difficult road of healing, but it was a step nonetheless. And for Phil, that was enough to keep moving forward. Phil's life had been in a constant state of flux for months. Each day felt like a struggle as he faced the consequences of his actions, the neglect of his family, the erosion of his marriage, and the collapse of his personal and professional life due to his addiction. But amidst the turmoil, one thing had remained constant: his desire to make things right, to rebuild his life, and most importantly, to heal his fractured relationship with Gina. As the days passed, things began to shift. The restaurant, which had once been a symbol of his success, had transformed under Rebecca's leadership. She had taken the reins in his absence and turned it into something more than just a business. It had become a thriving hub of warmth, energy, and community. And in this new environment, Phil could finally begin to focus on what truly mattered: his family. The tension between Phil and Gina was still palpable, but the walls that had once stood between them were beginning to crack. Gina, despite the hurt and the betrayal, had allowed herself to soften toward Phil. She wasn't ready to forget, but she was slowly starting to trust him again. For the first time in a long time, Phil felt like he was truly present for his children, Ethan and Lily, something that had been absent for far too long. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was a rare moment of peace. The laughter of his children filled the room, and for a brief moment, Phil felt a sense of normalcy return. He glanced at Gina, who was sitting across the table, her eyes meeting his. The softness in her gaze was a reminder of how far they had come. Even if it hadn't been easy, they were still healing, still finding their way back to each other, but there was a shared understanding now that hadn't existed before. That evening, after dinner, Gina approached Phil as he was cleaning up the kitchen. There was a quiet resolve in her steps, a mixture of hesitation and purpose. She had been through so much, and yet, there she was, still willing to try, still willing to meet him halfway. Phil turned to face her, his heart pounding. This wasn't just another conversation about their problems, it was a conversation about their future. "I've been thinking a lot," Gina began, her voice calm but tinged with emotion. "About us, about what comes next." She paused, as if gathering the courage to say what was on her mind. "I don't want to live in the past anymore, Phil. I don't want to keep holding on to all the hurt. I know it's not going to be easy, but I think I'm ready to move forward. Together." Phil's breath caught in his chest. For so long he had waited for this moment, the moment when Gina would finally see the man he had become, the man he wanted to be for her and for their children. "Gina," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't deserve this, but I'm going to prove to you every day that I'm worth it. I'll never stop trying." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of their shared history, yet filled with hope for what was to come. Gina didn't say anything in return immediately, but the way she looked at him, the way her eyes softened, told him everything he needed to know. She was willing to give him another chance, but this time, it wasn't about promises. It was about action. It was about proving, every day, that he could be the man she needed him to be. In the weeks that followed, Phil's actions began to speak louder than any words ever could. He was there for Gina and the children in ways he hadn't been before. He was present, emotionally available, and committed to making things work. He cut back on his work hours, allowing more time for family, and began attending therapy to address his addiction. He understood that recovery wasn't just about stopping the drinking, it was about rebuilding the trust, the intimacy, and the connection that had been lost over time. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, there was a palpable sense of peace. The children were laughing, Gina was smiling, and Phil couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had fought for this, for the chance to heal, for the chance to be the father and husband his family deserved. The road had been long, and the scars would never fully disappear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. That night, as they all sat together watching a movie, Gina reached for Phil's hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They didn't need grand declarations or promises anymore. They just needed each other. The trust they had once shared was beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, and it felt like a fragile but beautiful new beginning. Phil leaned back in his chair, his hand holding Gina's, and looked around at his family. He had learned, perhaps, too late, that success wasn't measured by a thriving business or the accolades of others. True success, he realized, was measured by the relationships you build, the love you nurture, and the willingness to fight for those you care about, even when things seem impossible. In that quiet moment, with his family around him, Phil felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid of the future. Whatever it brought, he knew that he wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would find their way back to each other. And for the first time in a long time, Phil believed that they could truly be whole again.